In 1981, three new portable radios arrived on the British High Street. The badge on the front was red and blue. The brand was Ever Ready. But these radios were not built in the heavy industrial workshops of Wolverhampton. Two had been manufactured in Malaysia. One had been manufactured in Hong Kong. The famous British battery empire was simply slapping its trusted name onto cheap imported plastics. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. Ever Ready was the absolute sovereign of British portable power. They assembled thousands of beautifully engineered valve radios every single week at the massive Canal Works factory. They did not build these wooden cabinets merely to compete with Bush or Murphy. They built radios for one ruthless reason: to give the British public a reason to buy their heavy dry cell batteries. But the real story of Ever Ready in Britain is not just the arrival of cheap imports. It is the story of how a battery monopoly built a wireless empire by accident, only to discover that the transistor, the alkaline cell, and the brutal logic of corporate asset stripping would systematically dismantle both. Britain built the rules. Engineers found the signal. The market changed the rules. We tell the stories of what happened when those forces collided. Every week, we tell the stories of British radios, wireless makers, and listening habits that once shaped how people heard voices, music, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Shepherd's Bush, London, in 1928. In the 1920s, Britain was a country of uneven illumination and silent rural spaces. The national grid was a sprawling ambition, not a reliable reality. Across the countryside, and even in the working-class streets of major manufacturing cities, domestic electricity was slow to arrive. If a family wanted to listen to the voices coming from the early BBC transmitters at Daventry or Savoy Hill, they could not simply plug a beautifully veneered wooden cabinet into a wall socket. They relied entirely on batteries. And battery-powered radio in the early days was a punishing, heavy, and occasionally dangerous domestic ritual. A standard valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, required two completely distinct power sources to function. It required a low-tension accumulator to heat the valve filaments, which was essentially a heavy glass jar filled with lead plates and sloshing sulfuric acid. Every week, a child or a father had to carry this precarious glass jar down the high street to the local cycle shop or hardware dealer to have it recharged for a few pence. The wireless set also required a high-tension battery, a massive dry block of zinc-carbon cells encased in pitch and heavy cardboard, producing anywhere from 90 to 120 volts. When the high-tension battery went flat, it could not be recharged. It had to be unclipped, thrown away, and entirely replaced. By 1934, the British public purchased more than 15 million high-tension radio batteries annually. The Ever Ready Company, Great Britain. Limited, operating out of London, dominated this market entirely. They manufactured the heavy dry cells that brought the British wireless to life. But Ever Ready executives understood a fundamental law of commerce. A battery is merely a solution waiting for a problem. To sell more high-tension blocks, they needed more British homes to own battery-powered radios. Instead of waiting for other manufacturers like Bush or Murphy to build those sets, Ever Ready decided to build the wooden boxes themselves. The strategy had begun taking shape in 1928, when Ever Ready purchased a highly successful London radio components company called Listen Limited. Founded by Thomas Noah Cole, Listen operated a massive works at Shepherd's Bush and another major facility at Islington, employing nearly 3,000 people. Ever Ready paid over £1 million for the firm, an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to over £60 million today. This ruthless acquisition secured an immediate, total command of domestic radio assembly. By 1935, the first receivers to officially bear the Ever Ready badge appeared on the British market. They were heavy, wooden-cased table radios, a radio designed to sit permanently on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. They were engineered with one underlying corporate philosophy. They were functional vessels for the zinc-carbon power packs manufactured in Ever Ready's own chemical plants. The Second World War interrupted this domestic rhythm, but it fundamentally cemented Ever Ready's importance to the national broadcasting infrastructure. The Listen factory at Islington obtained a vital ministry contract to assemble and repair so-called comfort sets for the armed forces. Robust, battery-powered radios designed to bring the BBC to men in barracks, tents, and fields. But in 1941, German bombs fell heavily on Islington, completely destroying the factory. Ever Ready could not stop building radios. The war effort required them, and the civilian population, desperate for news from the Home Service, relied on them. The company needed a new manufacturing base, far from the immediate devastation of the capital. In 1942, Ever Ready found available industrial space at the Canal Works in Park Lane, Wolverhampton. This specific relocation was the true beginning of the Ever Ready wireless empire. Wolverhampton became the mechanical heart of the company's radio division. The Canal Works was not a small assembly shed. It was a serious industrial facility capable of turning raw materials into finished acoustic furniture. When the war ended, Ever Ready did not retreat from the radio market. They doubled down. They released models like the Ever Ready Type A, a heavy 4-valve receiver housed in a wooden cabinet with a dark crackle paint finish. It was not a beautiful object, but it was a rugged utilitarian machine designed for a bruised nation. Crucially, it was powered by a massive Ever Ready B103 combined battery, forcing the listener straight back into the company's ecosystem. By the late 1940s, a distinct British listening habit had formed around these sets. A family in a rural cottage without mains electricity could hear the shipping forecast. A mechanic in a cold garage could listen to the light program, but they could only do so if they regularly visited the local hardware shop to purchase another heavy block of zinc carbon cells wrapped in blue and red cardboard. The high street electrical dealer became a vital partner in this system. A shopkeeper did not simply sell an Ever Ready radio once and wave goodbye to the customer. They sold the cabinet, and then they sold the power to run it, month after month, year after year. The blue and red delivery vans became as common a sight on British roads as the milk float or the Royal Mail truck, constantly restocking the shelves with fresh high-tension blocks. The physical weight of this logistics network was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of heavy batteries moved from the chemical plants to the regional depots, and finally to the shop counters, driven by the public's endless appetite for BBC voices. Ever Ready had successfully turned the wireless set from a luxury purchase into a recurring subscription. But their true breakthrough, the specific radio that would define the look, feel, and sound of the British mid-century portable, had not yet been drawn up in the Wolverhampton design rooms. In 1953, the Canal Works factory in Wolverhampton released a radio that would become an absolute fixture of British mid-century life. It was a device that perfectly understood the physical and economic realities of its era. It was called the Ever Ready Sky Queen. The Sky Queen was a portable radio, a radio designed to be moved from room to room or taken outdoors. But it was not small, and it was certainly not pocket-sized. To look at a Sky Queen today is to look at a masterclass in British domestic compromise. It was housed in a sturdy wooden cabinet, built to withstand the knocks of everyday household use. The entire cabinet was wrapped tightly in a light beige, imitation snakeskin plastic material, designed to look sophisticated in a sitting room while remaining wipe-clean for the kitchen. It featured a thick, clear Perspex handle, bolted firmly to the top, which folded flat when not in use. The front of the radio was dominated by a stamped, gold-colored metal speaker grille. Behind this grille sat the loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air. In the absolute center of the cabinet sat a large circular rotary tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to. It was a bold, legible face, allowing the listener to smoothly select between different BBC broadcasts. Inside the wooden cabinet, the engineering was thirsty and fragile. The Sky Queen relied on 4 delicate glass valves, a DK96, a DF96, a DAF96, and a DL96. A valve, a glass electronic device used to control and amplify signals before transistors replaced it, required significant electrical energy just to warm up its internal filaments. This is where Eveready's true corporate genius lay. The Sky Queen was designed to run on a single, massive combined battery, the Eveready B136. This battery provided both the 90 volts required for the high-tension circuit to amplify the signal and the 1.5 volts required for the low-tension circuit to heat the valves. The B136 was essentially a heavy, wax-sealed cardboard brick with 4 brass sockets on the top. It weighed nearly as much as the radio itself. When loaded, the Sky Queen weighed over 10 pounds. When a customer walked into a high-street electrical shop in 1953, they paid exactly 9 pounds and 10 shillings for the Sky Queen, plus purchase tax. In today's money, that was a significant investment, roughly equivalent to a week's wages for a skilled British labourer. But the initial purchase price was only the beginning of the transaction. The British radio moat that Eveready built around the Sky Queen was not just a beautifully wrapped wooden cabinet. It was an enforced physical subscription model. Every few weeks, when the light program began to sound distorted and the shipping forecast faded into static, the owner of a Sky Queen had to unclip the back panel of the radio. They had to pull out the heavy B136 battery, carry it down the high street to the local hardware store or independent radio dealer, and buy another one. Eveready owned the massive Canal Works factory in Wolverhampton that made the radio. They owned the massive chemical plants that manufactured the B136 battery. They owned the fleet of blue and red delivery vans that stocked the high street shelves. They owned the entire chain of British listening. Their distribution breakthrough was absolute. Eveready did not need to fight for window space against Roberts, Pi, or EKSO, because every hardware shop and cycle dealer in Britain already relied on Eveready vans for their flashlight batteries and standard zinc carbon cells. Placing the Sky Queen on the counter was effortless. The radio was simply added to the existing delivery manifest. The listening experience was robust. The Sky Queen was highly sensitive on both medium wave, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services, and long wave, a lower frequency broadcast band used for long-distance national radio reception. It used a wound internal frame aerial, a wire, rod, or internal component that receives radio waves from the air. This meant it could pick up the powerful Droitwich transmitter from almost anywhere in the country without needing a long external wire strung up in the garden. The Sky Queen became wildly successful. It became the default sound of the British picnic, the seaside holiday, the garden allotment, and the damp holiday caravan. It was endorsed by the sheer scale of its adoption. Rural communities without mains electricity relied on it. Housewives listened to it on the draining board. Families took it to the coast. The warm, rich tone of the wooden cabinet combined with the glowing valves gave it a presence that modern plastics could not match. When a listener turned the rotary knob, there was a satisfying mechanical click. They waited 5 seconds in silence. The B136 pushed voltage into the glass. The filaments glowed faint orange. And then, the steady, authoritative voice of the BBC Home Service filled the room. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By the mid-1950s, Eveready was no longer merely a battery supplier. They were a colossus of British consumer electronics. The geography of this empire was vast, industrial, and meticulously integrated. London provided the corporate direction from the head office at Eveready House in Whetstone. The Group Technical Centre in Haringey provided the acoustic and chemical research. The factory in Dawley churned out heavy zinc carbon cells by the thousands, and the massive canal works in Wolverhampton cut the wood, applied the snakeskin leatherette, soldered the tuning capacitors, components that change the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, and aligned the tuning dials. London provided the capital. Wolverhampton built the cabinet. Dawley poured the zinc. Droitwich carried the signal. Broadcasting House gave it a voice. The High Street sold the set. Britain made it a habit. Following the triumph of the Sky Queen, Eveready expanded the line into a formidable dynasty. In 1954, they released the Sky Prince, a slightly larger table radio. A radio designed to sit permanently on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. In 1955, they released the Sky Monarch, an ambitious AM/FM set. This allowed the radio to receive the newer VHF-FM broadcasts, a radio band that gives clearer sound over shorter distances than older AM bands. It featured a staggering 6 valves and an early Magic Eye tuning indicator. They even built the Briefcase N3, a portable radio disguised as a piece of executive luggage aiming at traveling businessmen who wanted to stay connected to national speech. At their absolute peak, the Canal Works factory in Wolverhampton was producing 5,000 radio receivers every single week. Over 1 million radios eventually left the Park Lane assembly lines. This was the undisputed golden age of the British valve portable. The British High Street was dominated by independent radio dealers, local hardware shops, and dedicated electrical counters. A customer could walk into almost any shop, in any town in Britain, and see the familiar blue and red logo in the shop window. The Eveready delivery trucks were as common a sight as the milk float or the Royal Mail van. They were the arteries of the operation, moving batteries and beautifully finished wooden cabinets across the country. They supplied the coastal holiday towns, the deep rural communities, and the sprawling new post-war housing estates. They ensured that when a family wanted the light program, the local shopkeeper always had the equipment and the power to provide it. Every radio sold was also a strict commitment to service. The local independent dealer did not just sell the set, they maintained it. If a tuning dial slipped, or a valve grew noisy after thousands of hours of use, the radio was taken to the local repair bench. Service engineers, guided by thick manuals and articles in enthusiast magazines like Practical Wireless, would carefully unscrew the back panel, test the capacitors, components that store and release electrical energy in a circuit, and solder new connections. This network of high-street service counters gave the British public total confidence in the Eveready name. But the cultural peak of Eveready in Britain was not defined by the sheer volume of their logistics. It was defined by how seamlessly their radios blended into the domestic background. Picture a British kitchen in 1956. The room is cold in the early morning. On the windowsill, beside a chipped teacup, sits an Eveready Sky Queen. The imitation snakeskin is slightly worn at the corners. The Perspex handle catches the pale morning light. A hand reaches out, turns the rotary volume control with a satisfying click, and waits. For 5 seconds, there is silence. Then, as the B136 battery pushes voltage through the fragile filaments of the glass valve, a faint hum emerges from the stamped metal grill. The hum gives way to the precise, trusted voice of the BBC Home Service. That interaction, the mechanical click, the patient wait, the warm orange glow of the glass, the sudden arrival of the signal, was repeated in millions of homes every single morning. The set either found the voice in the air, or it did not, and the Sky Queen always found it. Everready effectively owned that morning ritual. They owned the physical space on the kitchen draining board, they owned the sound in the room, and crucially, they owned the heavy battery that made it all possible. The scale of Eveready's British dominance in the late 1950s was almost difficult to comprehend. They were not merely participating in the domestic audio market, they were entirely subsidizing it through industrial chemistry. By 1958, the company commanded an estimated 90% of the British domestic dry battery market. To secure and defend that absolute monopoly, the Canal Works factory in Park Lane, Wolverhampton, had to keep churning out the wooden and plastic vessels that consumed those batteries. At its manufacturing zenith, the Wolverhampton assembly lines were building up to 5,000 radio receivers every single week. Over 1 million Eveready radios eventually left the Midlands factory floor. This was an astonishing volume for a company whose primary identity was built on zinc, carbon, and cardboard. The product line expanded rapidly to capture every conceivable British listening habit. They built the Sky King, the Sky Baronet, and the Sky Baby. A smaller, lighter, portable radio designed for younger listeners, garden allotments, and day trips. But no matter the size of the wooden cabinet, the shape of the metal grill, or the color of the imitation leatherette, the corporate logic remained ironclad. Each new model required a specific, proprietary, Eveready high-tension battery to wake up the glass valves. This created an inescapable, highly lucrative retail loop across the British high street. An independent radio dealer in a small market town did not survive simply by selling one radio to a family every 10 years. They survived on the constant, reliable foot traffic generated by the power supply. Every few weeks, a customer would return to the shop, place a heavy, exhausted B136 or B103 battery on the wooden counter, and purchase a fresh one. The local radio shop became as regular a domestic stop as the butcher, the baker, or the newsagent. The physical infrastructure required to sustain this national listening habit was staggering. A vast fleet of Eveready delivery vans, painted in the company's signature red and blue, crisscrossed the British road network daily. They traveled from the massive battery plants to regional distribution depots and finally down the narrow high streets of coastal holiday towns, deep rural villages, and sprawling urban centres. They ensured that whether a listener was tuning in from the Scottish Highlands or the Cornish coast, the power supply was never more than a short walk away. Furthermore, when the radio itself needed attention, the local repair bench was ready. Service engineers, armed with soldering irons, replacement capacitors, and schematics printed in magazines like Practical Wireless, kept the Wolverhampton cabinets singing for decades. The cultural moment of the Eveready Portable was defined by this unique combination of portability and absolute reliance on the local shop. It was the golden era of the British picnic, the seaside holiday, and the damp weekend in a static caravan. Picture a damp bank holiday in North Wales in 1958. Inside a cold holiday caravan, sitting on a Formica table, rests an Eveready Sky Prince. The beige cabinet is slightly scuffed from the boot of a car. The Perspex handle is folded down. The tuning dial, The printed scale guiding the listener to a specific broadcast frequency glows faintly in the dim afternoon light. Outside, the rain hits the metal roof. Inside, the heavy B136 battery pushes 90 volts through the circuit, and the room is instantly warmed by the rich, reliable sound of the BBC Light program. The listener did not have to worry about mains electricity. They did not need a wall socket. They only needed to ensure they had visited a local hardware shop before leaving home. But this absolute triumph of synergy, the perfect alignment of Wolverhampton woodworking, Dawley battery chemistry, and British high street retail, contained a fatal flaw. The entire empire was built on the assumption that radios would always require massive amounts of power to heat glass valves. The company was about to discover that efficiency is the enemy of the consumable. The era of the glass valve was closing. The era of the transistor, a tiny electronic component that amplifies signals with virtually no heat and requires a fraction of the power, was about to rewrite the rules of the British radio market. The destruction of the ever-ready radio and wireless empire in Britain was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow, structural strangulation, driven by 5 overlapping market forces that the company could neither control nor escape. The architecture of their success became the exact blueprint of their collapse. The turning point for the British radio division did not arrive in the 1980s with corporate raiders, but in 1957, precisely when the company appeared to be at its most innovative. That year, Ever-Ready released the Sky Leader. This was a transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and vastly more battery-friendly. Outwardly, the Sky Leader was a triumph. It maintained the familiar handsome wooden cabinet wrapped in imitation leatherette, and it still wore the trusted red and blue badge on the tuning dial. But internally, the heavy B136 high-tension battery was gone, replaced by a much smaller, cheaper power source. Ever-Ready had successfully modernized, but in doing so, they had inadvertently sabotaged their own economic foundation. By 1961, the Wolverhampton factory produced its final valve receiver, the Sky Captain, closing the era of glass and heat forever. As the 1960s progressed, Force 1, British cabinet, valve, transistor, component, labor, and manufacturing costs, began to suffocate the canal works. Wolverhampton was a heavy industrial site designed for a specific kind of manufacturing. Building an Ever-Ready radio required skilled British labor. Wood had to be precisely cut, heavy plastic perspex handles had to be molded, and complex circuits had to be carefully laid out. Before the widespread adoption of the printed circuit board, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, workers had to manually wire valve bases, solder connections, and install resistors, a component that limits or controls the flow of electrical current. As domestic British labor costs rose steadily throughout the 1960s and 70s, maintaining a massive, dedicated radio assembly plant in the Midlands became punishingly expensive. Ever-Ready discovered a brutal retail truth. A beautifully built, hand-aligned British radio simply cost more to manufacture than the mass market was eventually willing to pay. They were subsidizing their expensive woodworking and assembly lines with battery sales, but the batteries were no longer generating the massive profit margins of the valve era. Simultaneously, the company was battered by Force 2, BBC standards, license culture, and reception expectations. The British public was fundamentally changing how it listened. The trusted, singular voice of the Home Service and the Light program began to fragment. Listeners increasingly demanded clearer, interference-free VHF-FM signals, a radio band that gives clearer sound over shorter distances than older AM bands. They wanted stereo sound in their sitting rooms. They wanted sophisticated hi-fi separates, not a heavy beige box sitting on the kitchen draining board. The simple, rugged AM portable radio that had dominated the 1950s was no longer the prestigious centerpiece of the British household. It was relegated to the potting shed, the garage, or the garden allotment. Ever-Ready struggled to adapt to this shift. Their brand identity was entirely wrapped up in utilitarian, go-anywhere medium-wave reception. When the BBC began pushing heavily into FM broadcasting, the complex circuitry required to receive it drained batteries faster, presenting an engineering dilemma for a company that built portables. A radio was not only an object, it was an interface with a national institution, and when that institution moved the goalposts, the wooden cabinets in Wolverhampton struggled to keep up. The physical landscape of British shopping also turned against them, driven by Force 3, high street retail, rental chains, catalogs, and online price pressure. In the 1950s, Ever-Ready had relied on a vast network of independent high street radio dealers, cycle shops, and hardware counters. These were shopkeepers who valued the Ever-Ready delivery van, who happily stocked massive high-tension batteries, and who possessed the technical skill to repair a Sky Queen on a workbench in the back room. But by the 1970s, the local independent dealer was disappearing. They were being rapidly replaced by aggressive discount retailers, massive department stores, and high-volume mail-order catalogs like Argos. These new retail channels did not care about the Ever-Ready legacy. They did not care about the acoustic resonance of a wooden cabinet. They cared exclusively about margins, shelf space, and inventory turnover. A catalog page had no room for romance. The high street electrical shop, once a temple of British engineering, became a brutal battleground of price tags, and Ever-Ready's expensive Wolverhampton overheads made them uncompetitive on the changing shop floor. This vulnerability on the high street left Ever-Ready entirely exposed to Force 4, imports, private labels, and good enough listening. By the late 1960s, British ports were flooded with brightly colored, mass-produced transistor radios from Hong Kong and Japan. Companies like Sony and Panasonic, alongside a wave of unbranded private label sets, began appearing on supermarket shelves and discount store counters. They were smaller, lighter, and vastly cheaper than anything Wolverhampton could produce. They did not have heavy wooden cabinets, complex chassis designs, or imitation snakeskin leatherette. They were cheap, molded plastic. But they caught Radio 1 perfectly well under the bedsheets, and they played the top 40 hits in the garden without breaking the bank. The British listener, faced with the choice between a heavy, expensive Ever-Ready portable and a cheap, disposable imported set, increasingly chose convenience. The imported radio did not need to last for decades, and it did not need to be taken to a repair bench when it failed. It only needed to find the signal today. When it broke, it was simply thrown away and replaced. Ever-Ready's reputation for rugged durability meant nothing to a teenage listener who just wanted a pocket-sized device for their bedroom. But Force 5, technological, retail, and listening culture shift, was the fatal blow. The transistor radio was an engineering miracle, but for Ever-Ready's specific British business model, it was a commercial parasite. A valve radio, like the Sky Queen, devoured high-tension batteries, guaranteeing repeat sales at the local hardware shop. A transistor radio merely sipped power. A listener could run a small imported transistor set for months on a few cheap zinc carbon cells. The razor and blades economic model that had built the Canal Works factory was collapsing under the sheer efficiency of the microchip. Ever-Ready had built a magnificent radio empire specifically to sell consumable power, and the world suddenly stopped consuming power at the same rate. To compound the tragedy, Ever-Ready's core battery division made a catastrophic strategic error. In the early 1970s, Their research laboratory in Tottenham developed a highly effective, long-life alkaline battery. Alkaline batteries, a newer chemical design that lasts significantly longer than traditional zinc-carbon under heavy loads, were the inevitable future of portable electronics. But ever-ready executives, protective of their existing massive profit margins, decided not to put the alkaline design into mass production. They believed the British public would remain blindly loyal to their cheap, blue and red zinc-carbon cells. It was a fatal miscalculation. Duracell arrived in Britain, captured the lucrative high-power alkaline market, and left Eveready defending a dying low-tier technology. The retreat began in the boardroom. In 1978, in a misguided attempt to sound more international and modern, Eveready changed its corporate name to the Barek Group. They erased one of the most trusted consumer electronics brands in British history overnight, replacing it with an acronym that meant absolutely nothing to the average high street shopper. The company was now fundamentally vulnerable. Their domestic radios were too expensive to make, their batteries were losing market share, and their brand name had been recklessly discarded. In 1981, the British turning point arrived. The Hanson Trust launched a hostile takeover. Lord Hanson was not a radio engineer. He was not interested in the acoustic heritage of the canal works. He was a corporate raider. His strategy was absolute, unsentimental asset stripping. Almost immediately, Hanson began tearing the empire apart. He correctly identified that the Barek name was a disaster and immediately reverted the UK brand back to Eveready, but the restoration of the name was the only act of preservation. Hanson aggressively closed factories. He slashed the workforce, immediately cutting jobs from 2,900 down to 2,000 across the country. The Advanced Projects Group in Abingdon was sold off. The legendary research laboratory in Tottenham was shuttered, scattering decades of British acoustic and chemical expertise to the wind. The radio division in Wolverhampton was already a ghost of its former self, having quietly wound down heavy domestic production as the labor and component costs became unjustifiable. By 1981, Eveready radios were no longer a product of British industry. The brand name was simply slapped onto imported plastics. 3 offshore models were introduced that year, 1 manufactured in Hong Kong, 2 manufactured in Malaysia. The badge remained, but the promise was gone. The collapse accelerated through the 1980s and 90s. The massive battery megaplant at Tanfield Lea in County Durham, a colossal facility built in 1968 that had employed thousands of ex-miners, was eventually targeted for closure. In 1992, the Hanson Trust, having extracted every ounce of value from the carcass of the company, sold Eveready to the American giant Ralston Purina, the parent company of Energizer. To the new overseas owners, the British manufacturing infrastructure was a liability, not an asset. The Wolverhampton Canal Works had long since ceased to matter. The supply chains were dismantled. The cabinet molds were discarded. The service manuals were thrown away. The local repair networks dissolved. The repair counter closed. The catalog dropped the set. The delivery van stopped coming. The Wolverhampton line stopped. The factory fell silent. The workers went home. The brand moved overseas. The dial stopped glowing. The smart speaker answered instead. Today, the Eveready brand is a ghost in the British electronics landscape. The name survives only as a sub-brand under the Energizer Holdings umbrella. It occasionally appears on cheap, low-tier zinc chloride batteries in discount shops and supermarket aisles, entirely divorced from its heavy industrial heritage. The British radio division is completely extinct. There are no Wolverhampton cabinet makers cutting wood. There are no Tottenham acoustic engineers testing loudspeakers. There are no blue and red high-street delivery vans dropping off heavy high-tension blocks to local radio dealers. But in the secondary market of British radio preservation, the ever-ready name still commands fierce, obsessive respect. Across vintage radio forums, on eBay, on Gumtree, and at British Vintage Wireless Society, swap meets in cold village halls. The heavy valve portables of the 1950s remain highly sought after. Collectors actively hunt for surviving Sky Queens, Sky Princes, and the elusive six-valve Sky Monarch. When a British enthusiast finds an old ever-ready set in a charity shop or a dusty loft, they do not see a piece of obsolete technology. They see a mechanical puzzle waiting to be solved. Because the original B136 and B103 high-tension batteries have not been manufactured for decades, the British enthusiast community has engineered an elaborate, highly dedicated workaround. Today, a vintage radio repairer will spend hours scanning and printing replica, ever-ready cardboard battery sleeves. They meticulously wire modern D-cell batteries and small 9-volt blocks together in series, carefully soldering the connections to recreate the exact 90 volts required to wake up the glass valves. They source replacement capacitors, components that store and release electrical energy, to replace the original wax paper versions that have degraded over 70 years. They clean the tuning capacitors, polish the brass sockets, and carefully wipe down the imitation snakeskin leatherette. They do this because the Wolverhampton cabinets were built so robustly that the circuits still desperately want to work. An old, ever-ready portable radio with a repaired chassis, a cleaned tuning dial, and a loudspeaker still moving air can do something a smart speaker often cannot. Make listening feel attached to a physical, deliberate action. Not because it is old, because the act of tuning, the heavy mechanical click of the rotary switch, the patient 5-second wait for the valves to warm up, the manual searching for the Droitwich transmitter along the medium-wave band, still asks the listener to meet the broadcast signal halfway. The physical geography of the ever-ready empire, however, has been almost entirely erased from the British map. The massive front of the old Canal Works factory in Park Lane, Wolverhampton, where over 1 million wooden cabinets were once assembled, was largely demolished in the early 2000s to make way for modern housing and commercial redevelopment. The colossal Tanfield Lee battery plant in County Durham, which once employed thousands of ex-miners to pour zinc and carbon, is completely gone. The advanced research laboratories in Tottenham are a faded memory. The local high street electrical shops that proudly displayed the red and blue badge in their windows have been replaced by coffee chains, estate agents, or empty storefronts. The entire logistical network of British listening has vanished. But there is one final, unexpected footnote to the ever-ready story. A design that proves how brilliantly the British company could adapt to severe constraints when required. In 1948, an executive visiting Ever-Ready's South African subsidiary was approached by the man in charge of broadcasting in Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia. He asked if Ever-Ready could design a tropicalized dry battery radio that could be sold for just £5. It was intended to reach deep rural communities with absolutely no electrical infrastructure, where a radio receiver had never been seen before. The Ever-Ready engineers back in Britain accepted the challenge. They developed a highly sensitive, small, 4-valve shortwave receiver. To keep the cabinet manufacturing cost as low as possible, they did not use traditional wood or heavy bakelite. They went to a British aluminium factory, purchased standard 10-inch cooking saucepans, removed the handles, punched a large hole in the bottom for the loudspeaker, sprayed them metallic blue, and bolted the radio chassis inside. They called it the Saucepan Special. Powered by a massive, ever-ready, high-tension battery that sat underneath the aluminium casing, nearly 250,000 of these converted British saucepans were sold across Africa and Malaysia. They brought news, music, and voices to villages that had never heard a broadcast before. It was a triumph of pure utilitarian engineering, proving that Ever Ready was always, at its core, a company that built incredibly durable boxes simply to sell the power required to run them. The story of Ever Ready reveals a profound truth about how Britain builds, sells, and ultimately discards its domestic technology. Britain deeply valued the trust, the heavy engineering, and the familiar domestic ritual that Ever Ready provided to millions of kitchens, sitting rooms, and holiday caravans. But the market eventually rewarded only the brutal efficiency of the microchip, the longer lifespan of the alkaline cell, and the cheap margins of the offshore assembly line. The gap between what a culture loves to remember and what a market actually sustains is exactly where massive empires like Ever Ready disappear. Yet, somewhere in Britain, the objects refuse to vanish completely. An Ever Ready Sky Queen sits quietly on a vintage repair bench in a cold shed, its beige snakeskin worn smooth by decades of handling, its tuning dial dark, its grill dusty, waiting for a hand to turn the knob and find one more voice in the air. See you in the next one.